In the summer of 1883, federal investigators arrived at a place known to locals as the Garden of Eden. This Christian community in southwestern Kansas had been mysteriously abandoned overnight. Beneath the flower beds, they would discover something that haunted them forever. 9 families had vanished without a trace over 11 years, their leaders claiming they had left for missionary work. But skeletal remains were found by investigators in mass graves, their life savings stolen. The New Eden Christian community wasn't a sanctuary. It was a killing field. Before we continue with the story of Prophet Isaiah Richardson and his family of killers, remember this channel isn't for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truth behind America's most disturbing mysteries. If you're brave enough to hear the stories few channels tell, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. Everything you thought you knew about faith and trust will be questioned by this story. On the Kansas prairie, what happened during those 11 years would become one of the most systematically concealed crimes in American history. And tonight you'll learn why the federal government wanted this story to disappear forever. The year was 1871, and possibility and danger still marked the raw Kansas frontier. 60 miles southwest lay Dodge City, a lawless cattle town where gunshots punctuated Saturday nights like church bells on Sunday mornings. But 30 miles northeast of Dodge, in a fertile valley where Crooked Creek meandered through endless grassland, a different kind of settlement was taking root. Nearly 2,000 acres of prime farmland were occupied by the New Eden Christian community, purchased with what appeared to be substantial Eastern investment. Unlike the rough-hewn homesteads scattered across the prairie, impressive wooden structures were boasted by New Eden. A grand meeting hall with stained glass windows shipped from Chicago, multiple dormitory buildings that could house dozens of families, workshops for blacksmithing and carpentry, and most striking of all, the Prophet's house, a 3-story Victorian mansion that seemed impossibly grand for the Kansas wilderness. With his wife, Elder Sarah Richardson, and their 23-year-old son, Joshua, Prophet Isaiah Richardson arrived in Kansas in the spring of 1871. A tall, commanding figure was Isaiah, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. The authority of someone who had communed with the divine was carried by his voice, deep and resonant, capable of making grown men weep with conviction or tremble with fear. A different kind of power was possessed by Sarah, his wife of 26 years. The quiet, watchful intelligence of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. The community's daily operations were managed by her with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. Their son, Joshua, combined his father's physical presence with his mother's calculating mind, serving as the community's enforcer and the one who welcomed new families to their promised land. A unique doctrine was preached by the Richardson family, which they called divine simplicity. The belief that true Christians should abandon worldly possessions and live in communal harmony, sharing all resources for the greater glory of God. A life free from the struggles of frontier existence was promised to arriving families. No more failed crops. No more fear of Indian raids. No more winter starvation. In exchange, their worldly goods would be contributed by families to the community treasury, and they would submit to the spiritual guidance of Prophet Isaiah. By the end of 1871, 14 families had joined. By 1872, there were 28. By 1874, a stable population of 35 families had been reached by New Eden, approximately 175 men, women, and children living in what appeared to be perfect Christian harmony. Their life savings, their livestock, their tools, and most importantly, their unquestioning faith in Prophet Isaiah's divine mission were brought by each family. With remarkable prosperity, the community thrived. Despite the harsh Kansas climate, gardens yielded vegetables in abundance. Furniture and tools of exceptional quality were produced by the workshops and sold in distant markets. 6 days a week, children attended school, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also music and art. Times of fellowship and spiritual instruction were evening meals in the Great Hall, with sermons delivered by Prophet Isaiah that spoke to the deepest longings of the human heart. But rules existed in New Eden, rules that newcomers learned gradually. By Elder Sarah, all correspondence with the outside world had to be approved. Visits from relatives or friends were discouraged. After all, worldly influences that could corrupt the community's spiritual purity might be brought by them. Most importantly, once families committed their worldly goods to the community treasury, leaving became complicated. Visions of families who tried to leave had been shown by God to him, explained Prophet Isaiah. Terrible visions of failure, death, and damnation awaited those who turned their backs on the divine calling. What visitors didn't see were the closed-door meetings between the Richardson family, always held in the prophet's house after the evening meal. They didn't notice how certain families seemed to struggle with doubt or discontent, asking uncomfortable questions about community finances or challenging the absolute authority claimed by Prophet Isaiah. Most importantly, they didn't realize that the beautiful gardens surrounding the meeting hall, gardens that Elder Sarah tended with such devoted care, would eventually hold secrets capable of shattering their faith in humanity forever. To build a Christian community was not the reason the Richardson family had come to Kansas. They had come to perfect a system for becoming wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, all while hiding their crimes behind the unassailable walls of religious devotion. On a bitter February night in 1872, exactly 10 months after the Miller family had arrived at New Eden, the first murder happened. But to understand the true horror of what occurred, we must first understand how every detail of their unholy enterprise had been carefully planned by the Richardson family. Restless had been growing Herman Miller. Mainly of memorizing biblical passages and learning trades that seemed designed to benefit the community rather than prepare them for independent lives consisted the promised education for his children. More troubling, the community's finances had begun to be questioned by Herman. $400 in valuable livestock had been contributed by him to the treasury. Yet when winter clothing for his children was asked about by him, the community couldn't afford such luxuries had been told to him by Elder Sarah. That February evening, after the community's dinner in the Great Hall, Herman approached Prophet Isaiah. Unaware that they were about to witness the beginning of a pattern that would claim 9 families over the next 11 years, other families were settling into their evening routines. "Brother Isaiah," said Herman, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I've been thinking about our family's contribution to the treasury. $400 plus our livestock and tools. That's more than some men see in 5 years. Yet winter coats for the children we can't afford, tells me my wife." Swift and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's reaction. With what appeared to be righteous anger, his blue eyes flashed, but watching from across the hall, Joshua Richardson recognized it as something else entirely, the cold fury of a predator whose prey had just revealed dangerous intelligence. Quickly, the confrontation escalated, with Herman growing more insistent about accountability and Isaiah becoming more dramatically offended by what he called worldly thinking. Finally, for silence, his hand was raised by Prophet Isaiah. "Brother Herman, I can see the devil has been whispering doubts in your ear. Come to my house after evening prayers and together we'll seek divine guidance." Through the snow to the prophet's house walked Herman Miller at 10 o'clock that night, expecting a private discussion about his concerns. At the door, he was met by Joshua Richardson, who explained that in the study, his father was waiting. A comfortable room on the first floor was the study, lined with religious books and warmed by a large fireplace. With minor variations 8 more times over the following decade, what happened next would be repeated. "Brother Herman," Isaiah began, his voice gentle and concerned. "I want you to know that your worries are understood by me. But something remarkable about your family's future has been shown to me by God. A special mission that will bring great glory to his name." As Isaiah spoke, that Joshua had entered the room and was standing behind him was noticed by Herman. Suddenly uneasy made Herman something in the younger man's posture. But before he could turn around completely, around his throat were Joshua's powerful hands. Brief but violent was the struggle. A strongman was Herman Miller, hardened by years of frontier life, but no match for Joshua's calculated brutality was he. Still on the study floor lay Herman's body within minutes, his neck broken with professional efficiency. This technique had been practiced by the Richardson family before coming to Kansas, perfecting their method of killing without leaving obvious wounds or excessive blood. For every other aspect of what they called the harvest, they had also prepared. In a specially prepared pit behind the prophet's house, while Herman's body was disposed of by Joshua, to the Miller family's quarters went Isaiah and Sarah. With gentle voices, they woke Ruth Miller, explaining that during their prayer session, a heart attack had been suffered by Herman and he had passed peacefully into God's arms. 3 days after Herman's murder, supposedly in the early morning hours before the rest of the community awakened, the Miller family departed for California. That a divine vision calling her family to missionary work among gold miners had been received by Ruth was explained by Prophet Isaiah, and that to the railroad station in Dodge City, they had been escorted by Joshua. Of course, alive, the Miller family never left New Eden. On that cold February morning, in what would become Elder Sarah's memorial garden, Ruth Miller and her 4 children joined Herman. Swift were their deaths. Poison in their morning coffee, administered by Elder Sarah with the same gentle care she showed in all her domestic duties. By the time the rest of New Eden awakened, carefully sorted and stored had been the Miller family's belongings. In distant towns, their valuable items would be sold. To the Richardson family's growing treasury would be added their life savings, and in what Elder Sarah would designate as the community's first memorial garden would be buried their bodies, a beautiful flower bed where the faithful could remember departed loved ones and pray for missionaries spreading God's word in distant lands. The Miller family's departure was mourned by the other families in New Eden, and they prayed for their success in California. Over their graves, they had no idea they were praying. A pattern that would become terrifyingly routine over the next decade was established in the months following the Miller family's disappearance. A period of mourning and reflection was entered by the community. With increasingly powerful sermons about sacrifice, divine calling, and the temporary nature of earthly attachments being delivered by prophet Isaiah, closer together drew the remaining families, finding comfort in their shared faith and their trust in the Richardson family's spiritual guidance. Its careful pacing was the beauty of the Richardson family system. That eliminating families too frequently would create suspicion was understood by them. So strategically between murders, they spaced their activities. On recruiting new families, managing the community's legitimate prosperity, and most importantly, identifying their next victims through careful psychological observation, they focused. Throughout 1872 and 1873, with remarkable regularity, new families continued to arrive. Drawn by stories of New Eden's success that spread through church networks across the Midwest. A stable population of 35 families was maintained by the community, with new arrivals replacing those who had been called to missionary service or who had left for legitimate reasons. From Ohio in the spring of 1873 arrived Thomas Hartwell and his family, bringing substantial savings and 2 teenage sons who showed promise as craftsmen. A school teacher had been Thomas, and his intellectual curiosity made him valuable for managing New Eden's educational programs. But by the autumn of 1873, uncomfortable questions about record-keeping and financial accountability had begun to be asked by Thomas, making him dangerous to the Richardson family's control. On November 15, 1873, during evening prayers, a sudden illness was suffered by Thomas Hartwell. In the meeting hall, he collapsed, writhing in apparent agony before falling still. To Thomas's evening tea, a carefully measured dose of water hemlock had been added by Elder Sarah, who had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants gathered from the Kansas prairie. Thomas's tragic death was mourned by the community, and another divine vision was received by prophet Isaiah. God, he announced, has revealed that Thomas's widow, Mary, and their sons were called to join a special missionary expedition to work among Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota Territory. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, supposedly for their new mission departed the surviving Hartwell family. Like the Miller family before them, alive, the Hartwells never left New Eden. To the growing collection in Elder Sarah's memorial garden joined their bodies. To the Richardson family's treasury added their worldly goods, by divine mission and spiritual calling explained away their deaths. From Illinois in 1874 arrived the Kowalski family. Polish immigrants with skills in metalwork that proved valuable to the community's workshops. But an old-world skepticism about religious authority was possessed by Stephen Kowalski, making him question the absolute control over community finances claimed by prophet Isaiah. In February 1875, in a tragic accident perished the Kowalski family when their quarters caught fire during a winter storm. According to Joshua's tearful account, desperately he had tried to rescue them, but too quickly the fire had spread. In 1875, Elder Peterson joined the community, bringing his wife and daughter, along with substantial banking experience that initially seemed useful for managing New Eden's increasingly complex financial operations. But by early 1876, discrepancies between the community's supposed poverty and its actual expenditures had begun to be noticed by Peterson. During a severe prairie storm in May 1876, while working in the fields, lightning struck Elder Peterson. Soon, a divine calling to missionary work among railroad construction crews in Colorado was received by his widow and daughter. New lessons about refining their methods were taught to the Richardson family by each elimination. To vary their techniques they learned, sometimes accidents, sometimes illness, sometimes divine calling that separated families from their resources before their elimination. They also discovered that maintaining detailed records of their victims' assets, while dangerous, was necessary for converting stolen property into usable wealth through sales in distant markets. By the end of 1876, 4 families had been eliminated, and nearly $50,000 in cash, plus valuable property and livestock, was contained in the Richardson family's private treasury. More importantly, their system of identifying problematic families, manipulating religious devotion to maintain control, and eliminating threats while maintaining their reputation as devoted Christian leaders had been perfected by them. That they were living alongside a carefully constructed death trap was unsuspected by the community members who remained. For years, peaceful, productive lives in New Eden were lived by the vast majority of families. Only the Richardson family's apparent devotion to Christian principles was seen by them, the community's material prosperity, and the occasional inspiring examples of faithful families who had accepted God's calling to carry the gospel to distant and dangerous places. From the outside world, when letters arrived asking about missing relatives, masterpieces of religious rhetoric and believable explanation were Elder Sarah's responses. When government officials occasionally inquired about land ownership or tax obligations, meticulous was Prophet Isaiah's documentation and apparently flawless was his legal compliance. For the Richardson family, the years 1877 through 1880 marked a period of increasing confidence, but also growing danger as their success began to attract unwanted attention. Without creating suspicion, 4 families had been eliminated by them, substantial wealth accumulated, and New Eden established as one of the most prosperous religious communities on the Kansas frontier. But bold had made them success, and into risks that would ultimately expose their crimes was boldness about to lead them. From Missouri in April 1877 arrived the Brennan family, fleeing debts that had destroyed their farming operation. An Irish Catholic was Patrick Brennan, who had converted to Protestant Christianity after marrying his wife Margaret, and this religious transition had alienated him from his extended family back east. Their 6 children, ranging from 8 to 20, were brought by the Brennans, plus nearly $700 in savings that represented their entire life's work. One quality that made him ultimately incompatible with the Richardson family system was possessed by Patrick Brennan. He was a natural investigator. To be wary of religious authority had been taught to him by his Irish Catholic background, and skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true had made him his experience with financial ruin. By the winter of 1877, uncomfortable questions about the families who had supposedly departed from missionary work had begun to be asked by Patrick. "Brother Isaiah," said Patrick one evening after community prayers, "about the families that have left for missionary work, I've been wondering. In 3 years, from any of them, despite writing several myself, I've never received a single letter. Don't missionaries usually maintain correspondence with their supporting communities?" Immediate and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's response. "Brother Patrick, by your lack of faith in God's mysterious ways, I'm troubled. Often find themselves too isolated and busy to maintain regular correspondence do families called to frontier mission work. That they are fulfilling God's will even when we cannot see the results, we must trust." But Patrick's questions continued and they grew more specific. So suddenly, why did departing families always leave? Why were their destinations always vague and difficult to verify? Why was kept no official records of missionary activities by the community that could be shared with supporting churches in other states? Yet was the Richardson family's solution their most audacious. In March 1878, what appeared to be a miraculous divine intervention was staged by them. During evening prayers, suddenly collapsed Prophet Isaiah, writhing on the floor of the meeting hall in apparent supernatural agony. To his aid rushed Elder Sarah and Joshua, while in horror watched the assembled community as their spiritual leader seemed to battle with invisible forces. After nearly an hour of this terrifying display, to his feet rose Prophet Isaiah, his face radiant with apparent divine revelation. In a voice trembling with religious ecstasy, he announced that a vision of terrible danger threatening New Eden had been shown to him by God. Satan, he revealed, had sent agents to infiltrate the community and destroy it from within by spreading doubt and questioning divine authority. Identified by this revelation as the primary agent of Satan's influence, Patrick Brennan faced a choice. Submit completely to Prophet Isaiah's authority or be expelled from the community to face the harsh Kansas prairie alone with his family. By the supernatural events she had witnessed, terrified and desperate to protect her children, his wife Margaret begged Patrick to apologize and demonstrate his renewed faith. Complete and heartbreaking was Patrick's capitulation. Before the entire community, he publicly confessed his sins, admitted that his thoughts with doubt and suspicion had been corrupted by Satan, and pledged absolute obedience to Prophet Isaiah's divine guidance. But of allowing Patrick Brennan to live, the Richardson family had no intention. Too intelligent had been his questions, too dangerous his skepticism, and too significant his influence over other families. On April 20, 1878, in his sleep died Patrick Brennan, apparently of a heart attack brought on by the spiritual stress of his battle with Satan. Devastated by Patrick's death and convinced that his doubts had somehow caused his divine punishment, Margaret Brennan and her 6 children readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation that among Irish immigrants in Colorado mining camps, they were called to missionary work. For the importance of religious obedience, powerful witnesses would make their tragic loss. The now established pattern was followed by the Brennan family's departure for Colorado, except that their largest single haul of assets was provided to the Richardson family by their elimination, $700 in cash, plus valuable personal property that could be sold discreetly in distant markets. Between 1879 and 1881, two more families would fall victim to the Richardson system. The Schmidt family, German immigrants who made the mistake of questioning the community's lack of contact with Lutheran churches in their homeland, died in a food poisoning incident that affected only their household. In 1881 met their end the Caldwell family when Patriarch William Caldwell's drinking problem led him to make indiscreet comments about missing families and suspicious deaths. But ultimately bring down the Richardson enterprise with the elimination of the Caldwell family, because it included a victim who was too young to be manipulated by religious authority and too intelligent to accept the explanations that satisfied traumatized adults. On the frontier had grown up 16-year-old Emma Caldwell, where death was a frequent visitor and children learned early to observe adult behavior with careful attention. With simple observation after her mother's natural death from consumption in late 1880 began Emma's investigation. That very specific questions about her mother's family back east were asked by Elder Sarah was noticed by her. Did they write letters regularly? Would they expect to hear from the Caldwells soon? How much did they know about the family's plans in Kansas? When through her mother's belongings Emma was helping Elder Sarah sort, that all correspondence and family records were set aside by Elder Sarah was noticed by her. Important will be these documents when to missionary service God calls your family, explained Elder Sarah, speaking as if such a calling was already determined rather than merely possible. To patterns in the community's missionary departures began paying attention Emma. That families chosen for elimination were always those who had questioned community policies or possessed resources that made their elimination particularly profitable was realized by her. More disturbing was her discovery of a hidden storage room beneath the prophet's house containing personal belongings from families who had supposedly departed for frontier missions but had left behind their most precious possessions. In January 1881, a desperate decision was made by Emma. Detailed letters describing her observations and suspicions were written by her, addressing them to the sheriff in Dodge City, the federal marshal in Wichita, and her mother's brother in Illinois. But before she could mail the letters, her activities were discovered by Elder Sarah. The established pattern was followed by the Caldwell family's elimination in February 1881. But the first seeds of fear in the Richardson family's minds had been planted by Emma's desperate attempt to expose the truth. For the first time since they had begun their murderous enterprise, the possibility that their crimes might be discovered and punished was faced by them. In the wake of Emma Caldwell's investigation, the Richardson family's growing paranoia led them to make their first serious mistakes in nearly a decade of perfect murders. Emma's attempted exposure had failed, but her intelligence and determination had shown them how vulnerable their system could be to a victim who was smart enough to recognize patterns and brave enough to seek outside help. The beginning of the end for the Richardson family's reign of terror was marked by the elimination of the Caldwell family in February 1881, though they didn't realize it at the time. To protect their enterprise, Emma's death had been necessary, but her final words, shouted in desperation as Joshua cornered her against a cliff face, would haunt Elder Sarah for months afterward. 3 letters I wrote. Already mailed they are. What you've done here will be known by everyone. Of course, lying had been Emma. In her clothing were still hidden the letters, never having reached any post office or government official. But something no other victim had managed was achieved by her bluff. It planted genuine fear in the Richardson family's minds about the possibility of outside investigation. A series of decisions that would ultimately expose their crimes was led to by this fear. First, to accelerate their timeline for leaving Kansas was decided by them, planning to liquidate their remaining assets and relocate to California before any potential investigation could threaten them. Second, more aggressively they began eliminating evidence, burning documents, and personal items that they had previously preserved as trophies of their successful operations. Most fatally, before their departure, to eliminate one final family was decided by them. The Hoffmans, recent German immigrants who possessed both substantial savings and knowledge of their homeland's banking systems that could be valuable for establishing new identities in California. But from all previous operations differed the Hoffman elimination in June 1882 because by greed rather than necessity it was motivated and because hastily rather than with the careful preparation that had characterized their earlier crimes it was planned. A successful merchant in Prussia had been Klaus Hoffman before immigrating to Kansas with his wife Greta and their 3 teenage children. His European business interests for a substantial sum had been sold by him, converting his wealth into American currency and government bonds that he planned to use for establishing a new trading operation in the American West. The largest single financial opportunity the Richardson family had ever encountered was represented by the Hoffman family's arrival at New Eden in May 1882. But the most sophisticated victim they had ever targeted was also Klaus Hoffman. Naturally suspicious of New Eden's unusual financial arrangements made him his experience with international banking, and his knowledge of German immigrant communities across the Midwest meant that more likely to trigger outside investigation would be his disappearance than the elimination of isolated frontier families. To acquire the Hoffman assets before their planned departure led them to abandon their usual careful patience was the Richardson family's desperation. Instead of spending months evaluating Klaus's psychology and planning his elimination, within weeks of his arrival, to act was decided by them. To their first serious operational error in a decade of perfect crimes led this haste. On the night of June 15, 1882, using their standard technique of a private spiritual consultation in the prophet's house study, the Richardson family attempted to eliminate Klaus Hoffman. But suspicious of the community's operations since his arrival had been Klaus, and he had taken the precaution of telling his wife Greta to expect his return by midnight and to alert other community members if he failed to appear. When during the fake spiritual session, Klaus Hoffman was attempted to be overpowered by Joshua Richardson, unexpected resistance was encountered by him. Not only younger and stronger than previous victims was Klaus Hoffman, but he was also prepared for the possibility of violence. Loud and prolonged was the struggle that followed, creating noise that could be heard throughout the prophet's house and raising the possibility that other community members might investigate. More seriously, with a letter opener before being killed managed to wound Joshua Klaus, creating a blood trail and obvious signs of violence that could not be explained away as natural death or accident. For the first time in their criminal careers, the challenge of explaining obvious evidence of murder to community members who had been awakened by the sounds of struggle was faced by the Richardson family. Characteristically audacious but ultimately self-destructive was their solution. The next morning, that Klaus Hoffman had been possessed by demonic forces during their spiritual consultation was announced by prophet Isaiah, requiring a violent exorcism that had ultimately resulted in the demon's departure and Klaus's peaceful death. The traumatized community members who had heard the struggle were satisfied by this explanation, but it also created the first cracks in the Richardson family's reputation for divine authority and peaceful community leadership. Devastated by Klaus's death and terrified by the supernatural explanations they had been given, Greta Hoffman and her children readily accepted prophet Isaiah's revelation that as missionaries to their former homeland, they were called to return to Germany. For early July was scheduled their departure from New Eden, supposedly to catch a ship from New York back to Europe. But alive, the Hoffman family never left Kansas. And by someone the Richardson family had never considered a threat was witnessed their elimination on July 3, 1882. 8-year-old Timothy Weber, son of one of New Eden's most devoted families, who had been hiding in the prophet's house barn during a game of hide-and-seek when the murders occurred. Bodies into a wagon being loaded by Joshua Richardson was seen by Timothy, and about burial locations in the memorial garden heard instructions being given by Elder Sarah. Too young to understand the full implications of what he had witnessed was the child, but old enough to realize that as announced to the community, for Germany had not actually departed the Hoffman family. The first serious crack in the Richardson family's control over community information was created by Timothy's innocent questions to his parents about why the Hoffmans were buried in the garden instead of traveling to Germany. With his son's confused report, when Timothy's father, Elder Weber, approached prophet Isaiah, explanations that seemed increasingly strained and inconsistent were received by him. For the first time in 11 years, the official explanations for mysterious deaths and sudden departures began to be seriously questioned by a member of New Eden's community. A level of internal threat that the Richardson family had never faced before was created by Elder Weber's growing suspicions, combined with his knowledge of Timothy's eyewitness account. In this terrifying tale of New Eden, just when everything seems to be coming to a head, for a moment I want to pause. If this story is giving you chills, with a friend who loves dark mysteries, share this video. To support our content, hit that like button, and to never miss stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far is the truth about what happened next. How this house of horrors finally came crashing down, let's discover together. That their decade of perfect murders had finally created a witness they could not eliminate without destroying the community that provided cover for their crimes was about to be discovered by the Richardson family. Not with law enforcement, but with a persistent mother named Catherine Brennan McKenna, the older sister of Patrick Brennan, who had been murdered in 1878, began the investigation that would ultimately expose the Richardson family's crimes. In St. Louis lived Catherine, where her husband, Michael McKenna, worked as a federal customs inspector. Both the resources and the government connections necessary to pursue a thorough investigation into her brother's disappearance were possessed by Catherine, unlike most relatives of New Eden's victims. By the complete lack of communication from Patrick's family since their supposed departure for Colorado missionary work in April 1878 had Catherine been troubled. A faithful correspondent throughout his adult life had been Patrick, writing regularly to his sister, even during the most difficult periods of his farming struggles in Missouri. Entirely out of character seemed his complete silence after joining New Eden, especially given that 6 children, whose lives through letters Catherine would have expected him to share, he had. In the spring of 1882, to use his federal connections to make official inquiries about the Brennan family's whereabouts was Catherine convinced her husband. Federal Indian agents in Colorado Territory, railroad companies that handled passenger traffic to mining regions, and Catholic missionary organizations that worked among Irish immigrants in the Western Territories were contacted by Michael McKenna. Disturbing were the results. Of any family named Brennan engaging in missionary activities in Colorado or any other Western location during the specified time periods existed no record. Determined to visit New Eden and demand answers about Patrick's family, to Kansas traveled Catherine and Michael in August 1882, armed with this information. Very differently would have proceeded their investigation if they had announced their arrival in advance. But fortunately for the cause of justice, unannounced, to approach New Eden was decided by them, hoping to observe the community's normal operations before revealing their purpose. A community that seemed prosperous and well-organized, but also strangely tense and secretive was observed by Catherine and Michael during their 3-day reconnaissance of New Eden. On hills overlooking the settlement, they positioned themselves, using Michael's military field glasses to study the daily routines of community members. Immediate questions about New Eden's operations and the Richardson family's explanations for missing relatives were raised by what they saw. Well-maintained and recently expanded were the community's buildings, suggesting access to significant financial resources that seemed inconsistent with the struggling religious settlement dependent on donations. In the workshop sat expensive farm equipment and substantial investment in agricultural operations that would require more capital than 35 frontier families could reasonably provide was indicated by the quality of livestock visible in the pastures. More disturbing were the behavioral patterns noticed by Catherine among the community members. During evening gatherings visible through the meeting hall windows, almost frantic enthusiasm for religious activities seemed to be demonstrated by people, as if their devotion were being performed by them rather than genuine spiritual joy being expressed. Subdued and watchful appeared children, exhibiting the kind of hyper-alert behavior recognized by Catherine from her work with immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Ireland. Most significantly, something that confirmed their worst suspicions about New Eden's true nature was witnessed by Catherine and Michael. On their 3rd morning of observation, with what appeared to be urgent concerns, accompanied by his young son, Timothy, approaching Prophet Isaiah was seen by them Elder Weber. Clearly agitated was the conversation that followed, with Prophet Isaiah's usual commanding demeanor giving way to obvious anxiety and defensive gestures. Openly, that evening, approached New Eden Catherine and Michael, presenting themselves as relatives of Patrick Brennan and demanding to speak with community leaders about his family's current location. A stir of activity that confirmed their suspicions was created by their arrival. This was not a community accustomed to unexpected visitors or comfortable with outside scrutiny. In the community's meeting hall met them Prophet Isaiah Richardson, flanked by Elder Sarah and Joshua. Smooth and confident was his initial response to their inquiries, explaining that excellent work among Irish miners in remote mountain valleys was indeed being done by the Brennan family, who had departed for missionary work in Colorado. Letters supposedly written by Patrick describing the family's successful ministry and their plans to establish a permanent mission station in an isolated location were produced by him. But without learning to recognize his handwriting and writing style had not Catherine spent 40 years reading her brother's correspondence. Obvious forgeries were the letters shown to her by Prophet Isaiah. Similar, but not identical was the handwriting, and formal and religious in a way that Patrick, despite his spiritual devotion, had never used in personal correspondence was the language. Most damning, geographical references that Catherine knew were incorrect were contained in the letters, describing mining operations in locations where no such activities existed. "By my brother, these letters were not written," stated Catherine flatly, her Irish temper beginning to show. As having gentle valleys suitable for farming and family settlement would never describe the Colorado Rockies. Patrick. During the war, he served in the Colorado Territory, and harsh and dangerous were those mountains known by him. The first serious cracks in the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade were revealed by the confrontation that followed. Nothing to Catherine McKenna, who had been raised in the Irish Catholic tradition of questioning Protestant ministers, meant Prophet Isaiah's religious authority. Impossible to dismiss their concerns or intimidate them into leaving made her husband's federal credentials. Most importantly, that the Richardson family could not simply make them disappear like previous troublemakers meant their announced intention to report New Eden to territorial authorities. When using his federal investigator training, Michael McKenna began asking specific questions about New Eden's legal status and financial operations. Came the breakthrough. How was the community's land ownership documented? What records existed of the substantial property transfers that would be necessary for families to donate their worldly goods to the community treasury? Where were the tax records that territorial law required for large agricultural operations? Evasive and inconsistent were Prophet Isaiah's responses to these questions. That through divine guidance rather than earthly record-keeping were managed community finances was claimed by him, that for families who had transcended worldly concerns was unnecessary legal documentation, and that through special arrangements with territorial authorities that outsiders couldn't understand were handled tax obligations. That New Eden was operating outside legal boundaries in ways that suggested criminal activity were confirmed by these answers Michael's suspicions. Extensive experience recognizing financial fraud and property crime was had by him as a federal customs inspector. Systematic theft on a massive scale was suggested by the community's obvious prosperity, combined with the lack of legitimate documentation for its resources. But by 8-year-old Timothy Weber was provided the evidence that would finally expose the Richardson family's crimes. During the heated discussion between the adults, something that made Elder Weber's face turn pale with shock was whispered by Timothy to his father. When reluctantly his son's information was shared by Elder Weber, about New Eden began to emerge the truth. Contradicting the official story of their departure for Germany, the Hoffman family's burial in Elder Sarah's memorial garden had been seen by Timothy. More importantly, to examine the garden more carefully had led his innocent questions Elder Weber, revealing disturbing inconsistencies in the soil and unusual arrangements of flowers that suggested systematic burial of multiple bodies over several years. That would finally bring justice to New Eden's victims was the decision made by Catherine and Michael that night. Instead of confronting the Richardson family further, quietly for Dodge City they departed, where Michael's federal credentials would allow them to request an official investigation by territorial marshals. Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony, Elder Weber's observations about the memorial garden, and most importantly, evidence of systematic financial fraud that would justify federal intervention were carried with by them. With growing panic watched the Richardson family the McKennis leave, realizing that their most serious threat ever was facing their perfect system. For the first time in 11 years of successful murders, by federal authorities who possessed both the resources and the legal authority to expose their crimes was faced investigation by them. On September 10, 1882, when Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford arrived at the community with warrants to examine financial records and interview residents about missing persons reports filed by relatives in multiple states, began the federal investigation of New Eden. By a territorial attorney, a federal land office inspector, and 2 deputy sheriffs from Ford County was Crawford accompanied. They also brought something never encountered before by the Richardson family, legal authority that transcended religious claims and community autonomy. A community in the grip of carefully controlled panic was found by the investigators during their first day at New Eden. For this possibility had the Richardson family spent the previous 3 weeks preparing, coaching community members on appropriate responses to official questions and hiding or destroying evidence that might reveal the true scope of their crimes. But a fatal error that would ultimately expose everything had also been made by them. So confident in their system had they become that detailed records of their victims' property and possessions had been kept by them, believing these records would serve as evidence of legitimate business transactions rather than proof of systematic murder. Almost anticlimactic was Marshal Crawford's discovery of the hidden vault beneath the prophet's house. After hours of examining suspicious financial records and interviewing terrified community members, the vault contained personal belongings from 9 families carefully catalogued and stored with the efficiency of a criminal enterprise. Family photographs, personal Bibles, children's toys, wedding rings, and most damning of all, identity documents that proved these families had never left New Eden alive. But Elder Sarah's memorial garden, the beautiful flower beds where she had spent 11 years carefully tending blooms above the graves of her victims, was the physical evidence that finally broke the case. When based on Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony and his father's observations, investigators began excavating the garden, a carefully organized cemetery containing the remains of 47 men, women, and children buried in family groups with their personal possessions was uncovered by them, arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of the Richardson family's criminal activities. Swift and absolute was the Richardson family's arrest. On 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy were charged Prophet Isaiah Richardson, Elder Sarah Richardson, and Joshua Richardson, taken into custody. Traumatized by the revelation that they had been living above a mass grave for years, the surviving members of New Eden provided testimony that painted a horrifying picture of systematic manipulation, religious abuse, and calculated murder. One of the most sensational criminal cases in Kansas territorial history became the trial of the Richardson family, attracting newspaper coverage from across the nation and sparking congressional debates about federal oversight of religious communities. Not just the scope of their crimes, but the sophisticated psychological techniques they had used to maintain control over their victims and conceal their activities from outside scrutiny.